We trust people every day, often without realizing it. We trust a familiar voice, polite smile, a story that sounds reasonable enough. Most of the time, nothing happens. Life moves on. But sometimes, one small decision opens a door that cannot be closed the same way again. This story begins in that quiet space. Not with danger, not with urgency, but with a moment that felt ordinary, safe, even kind. There was no reason to hesitate, no warning sign that demanded attention, just a situation that invited empathy. Someone needed help, and help was given. First, it felt right, the kind of decision people are proud of making, the kind we hope others would make for us. Trust, in its purest form, feels simple. It asks us to believe before we know, to assume honesty without evidence, to act before doubt arrives. That is what happened here. The environment felt familiar, calm, unthreatening. Nothing was taken. Nothing was broken. No rules were crossed. At least not yet. What stood out wasn't behavior, but emotion, a sense of relief, a sense of belonging, a sense that someone had finally been seen. Those feelings can be powerful. They can quiet questions that might otherwise surface. And when trust is rewarded with gratitude, it reinforces itself. Everything appeared balanced. A shared understanding, mutual respect. But trust doesn't announce when it shifts. It doesn't arrive with alarms or sharp edges. It changes quietly, in tone, in expectation, in who feels entitled to what. Looking back, the signs were subtle. A pause held a second too long. A story repeated with slightly different details. A comfort that settled faster than expected. Nothing alarming. Nothing provable. Just enough to be dismissed. Because when we decide someone is safe, we stop evaluating their actions. We interpret everything through the lens of goodwill. That is the paradox of trust. It protects connection, but it also lowers defenses. And once lowered, those defenses are hard to raise without feeling cruel. No one wants to be the person who doubts kindness. No one wants to question sincerity. So small inconsistencies are ignored. Boundaries soften. Responsibility blurs. The situation continued, not because of manipulation, but because of belief. Belief that good intentions were enough. Belief that discomfort was just adjustment. Belief that asking questions would do more harm than good. That belief mattered, because trust doesn't just affect how we feel. It affects what we allow, what we excuse, what we delay confronting. And the longer trust remains unquestioned, the harder it becomes to recognize when it has been misplaced. This is not a story about betrayal in a dramatic sense. It is about realization, about understanding that trust, once given, creates responsibility on both sides. And when that balance quietly breaks, the consequences are rarely immediate. They arrive slowly, in the form of clarity. In the next part, we will look at how a well-intentioned decision began to reshape expectations, and why noticing that shift took longer than it should have. Kindness often begins without a plan. It appears in moments when saying yes feels easier than saying no. That was true here. The decision had already been made, not through logic, but through instinct. Helping felt natural, necessary even. There was no discussion about limits, no list of expectations, no careful framing of how long or how far. Those details felt unnecessary at the time. Trust filled the space where structure usually lives. First, everything felt balanced. Gratitude was expressed softly. Boundaries seemed understood without being spoken. The atmosphere stayed calm, predictable, comfortable, and comfort is persuasive. When someone settles in quickly, can feel reassuring, like proof that the right choice was made. Small routines formed. Nothing dramatic, just patterns, shared space, shared time, shared assumptions. Trust deepened not because of words, but because of familiarity. That's how most meaningful connections grow. But kindness has a hidden side. It creates emotional debt. Even when no one asks for repayment, the person offering help feels responsible. The person receiving help feels relief. Relief can look like peace, but it can also look like certainty, and certainty can change behavior. The gratitude began to shift, not into entitlement, but into comfort. Comfort with decisions, comfort with presence, comfort with speaking on behalf of the situation. Nothing inappropriate, nothing aggressive, just subtle confidence. There were moments when choices were made without checking, assumptions voiced casually, plans spoken as if already agreed upon. Each moment felt too small to interrupt, and interrupting kindness feels wrong. Questioning trust feels personal, as if doubt is an accusation. So the silence continued. Trust does not disappear all at once. It thins, like fabric worn by use, not torn by force. A few details began to feel slightly misaligned. Stories repeated but simplified. Emotions expressed with perfect timing. It all made sense, until it didn't. But sense isn't always clarity. When someone benefits from stability, they often protect it instinctively. That protection doesn't always look dishonest. Sometimes it looks helpful, offering opinions, taking initiative, speaking with authority born from comfort. And when kindness meets confidence, the line between guest and decision-maker can blur. This is where trust becomes complex, because trust isn't just about believing someone means well. It's about understanding how power shifts quietly, who adapts, who accommodates, who hesitates to speak. At this point, nothing felt dangerous. Nothing felt urgent. But something felt different. A subtle internal pause. A quiet thought that surfaced and disappeared. Is this how it was supposed to feel? That question mattered. Because trust should feel mutual. Not heavy. Not confusing. When kindness starts to feel like obligation, it's often the first sign that balance is changing. And yet, pulling back feels impossible, because pulling back requires admitting that the original decision might deserve re-examination. Most people don't want to question their own goodness, so the situation continued, smooth on the surface, unsettled underneath. The kindness remained real, the trust remained present, but something new had entered the space. Expectation. In the next part, we'll explore how expectation quietly replaces gratitude, and why recognizing that shift can feel more uncomfortable than ignoring it. Trust grows faster when stories feel familiar. When details match what we already understand, our minds relax. We stop checking the edges. That comfort can be misleading. At this stage, nothing felt wrong. But some things felt unusually easy. The stories flowed smoothly. Too smoothly. They arrived fully formed, with clear emotions, clear causes, clear explanations. There was very little uncertainty in them. Most people hesitate when recalling difficult experiences. They pause. They search for words. Here, the pauses were rare. Each explanation carried confidence, not arrogance, assurance. It felt practiced, but not rehearsed. That difference matters. Familiar stories are powerful because they mirror expectations. They sound like stories we've heard before. They align with what we believe is reasonable. And when something aligns, we stop asking why. The emotional tone stayed consistent, always appropriate, never excessive. Sadness but not desperation. Gratitude but not dependence. That balance builds trust quickly. Yet familiarity can also hide complexity. When a story leaves no loose ends, it offers comfort. But life rarely does that. There were moments when details felt compressed, simplified, not incorrect, just neat. And neat stories can be hard to question, because questioning them feels unnecessary. Why dig deeper when nothing seems out of place? But trust is not just about accuracy. It's about openness. And openness includes uncertainty. When uncertainty is missing, something important may be missing too. Still, nothing justified concern. Not yet. The familiarity continued to work its quiet effect. Routines reinforced it. Shared experiences made it stronger. Trust doesn't grow through logic alone. It grows through repetition. Seeing someone in the same space, in the same rhythms, creates an illusion of knowing. We confuse presence with understanding, and understanding with truth. There were small moments when questions almost surfaced, then disappeared. Moments like, why does this part always come up? Or, why does this explanation feel complete every time? But those thoughts felt unkind, so they were dismissed. Because when someone has already been welcomed, scrutiny feels like rejection, and rejection feels worse than uncertainty. This is how trust quietly changes shape. It becomes emotional commitment. Once that happens, the cost of questioning rises, not because of risk, but because of guilt. Questioning would mean admitting discomfort. Admitting discomfort would mean challenging the harmony, and harmony feels precious, especially when it seems fragile. So the familiar stories were accepted as truth, not because they were verified, but because they fit. And fitting stories don't invite resistance. They invite agreement. Agreement becomes silence. Silence becomes assumption. And assumption creates space, where expectations can settle without being noticed. The balance shifted again, almost invisibly. No one caused it intentionally. No one noticed it clearly. But the feeling of ease began to carry weight. Trust had moved from choice to habit, and habits are rarely questioned until they are interrupted. In the next part, we will explore how trust, once habitual, can quietly turn into permission, and why that transition often goes unnoticed until it matters. Trust often begins before proof appears. It arrives as a feeling, a sense of ease, a quiet decision that says, "This is okay." That decision had already been made, not once, but repeatedly. Everyday trust was renewed, without discussion, without confirmation. It lived in routine. Small acts reinforced it. Predictable behavior, consistent tone. Nothing demanded verification. And when nothing demands it, proof feels unnecessary. Trust became the default setting. Questions, when they surfaced, felt out of place. Why ask now? Why disrupt what seems stable? This is how trust becomes invisible. It blends into the background of daily life. No one announces, "I am trusting you." They simply act as if trust is already earned. And once it is treated as earned, it becomes powerful. Decisions begin to lean on it. Expectations quietly attach to it. The space felt shared, but control was subtly uneven. Not through force, through assumption. Simple choices were made casually, as if agreement was guaranteed. Nothing was demanded, nothing was taken, but something was assumed. Assumption is trust's quiet cousin. It doesn't ask permission. It moves forward gently, expecting no resistance. And resistance didn't come, because pushing back felt unnecessary. Everything still looked fine. Yet, there was a subtle shift in responsibility. One side adjusted more. One side waited less. Trust, once mutual, started to lean. Not enough to tip, just enough to notice. And noticing brought discomfort. Discomfort without explanation is easy to ignore. It feels like overthinking, like being ungrateful. So it was set aside. But trust offered without proof creates vulnerability, not because people are untrustworthy, but because situations evolve. When trust stands alone, without clarity or boundaries, it absorbs meaning. It starts to represent more than it should. It becomes approval, consent, agreement, even when none of those were spoken. This is where trust becomes fragile, because when expectations are built on silence, they collapse loudly. Still, no collapse had happened. Only quiet adjustments, small compromises made for peace, small hesitations swallowed. Trust remained intact, but it was no longer neutral, carried weight, and weight changes how trust feels. What once felt generous, now felt expected. What once felt flexible now felt assumed. These changes didn't announce themselves. They revealed themselves slowly, through feeling rather than fact. A moment of hesitation, a second thought before speaking. Those moments mattered. They were signals, not of danger, but of imbalance. Trust, at its healthiest, allows room for clarity. Here, clarity had been postponed, because postponing felt easier than addressing uncertainty. But uncertainty doesn't disappear. When ignored, it settles, it waits, and it grows. In the next part, we will examine how trust begins to create emotional cost, and why that cost often goes unnoticed until it starts to shape decisions. Silence can feel like agreement. When nothing is said, we assume nothing is wrong. That assumption creates comfort. The situation had reached that stage. There were no conversations about boundaries, no clarification about expectations, just shared silence. And silence, when repeated, starts to feel intentional. It suggested understanding, respect, balance. But silence can also hide hesitation. When questions remain unspoken, they don't disappear. They settle beneath the surface. At first, the silence felt peaceful. No tension, no conflict. Everything moved smoothly. That smoothness became reassuring. It told a quiet story. Everything is fine. And when everything appears fine, we stop listening to ourselves. Small moments passed without comment. A choice made without discussion. Plan implied rather than agreed. Each one felt minor, too small to address, too insignificant to risk discomfort. And so silence continued. Shared silence can feel like trust deepening, like two people understanding each other without words. But real understanding allows space for voice. Here, voice was slowly fading, not because it was taken, but because it felt unnecessary. That is how comfort changes shape. It shifts from ease to expectation, from generosity to routine. The silence began to feel heavier, not loud, not obvious, just present. It showed up as hesitation, as careful phrasing, as delayed responses. Those signals were subtle, easy to ignore, especially when the surface remained calm. Trust still existed, kindness still existed, but something else existed too. Avoidance. Avoidance of small corrections. Avoidance of brief discomfort. Avoidance of acknowledging uncertainty. Silence made avoidance easy, because silence asks nothing. It requires no explanation, no justification. It allows situations to continue unchanged. And unchanged situations feel safe, even when they aren't balanced. The emotional cost of silence is gradual. It accumulates slowly. Each unspoken thought adds weight. Each ignored feeling adds distance. Not between people, but between intention and reality. At this point, no one believed anything was wrong. But belief isn't awareness. Awareness requires attention, and attention had softened. Trust had become familiar enough to stop being examined. This is where many situations remain suspended. Not good, not bad, just unresolved. And unresolved trust has consequences. Creates confusion about responsibility, about who should speak, about who should adjust. When silence dominates, the person most willing to adapt ends up adapting the most, not because they are weaker, but because they value harmony. Harmony can be costly, especially when it is maintained through quiet compromise. The silence was no longer neutral, carried meaning. It suggested approval where none had been given. It allowed assumptions to grow, and those assumptions would soon demand clarity. But clarity, when delayed, rarely arrives gently. In the next part, we will explore how shared silence begins to affect emotional balance, and why breaking that silence can feel harder than remaining within it. Being believed changes how people carry themselves. When trust is given freely, it offers relief, validation, a sense of safety, but it also creates weight, because belief is not neutral. It shapes behavior on both sides. At this point, trust had settled in fully. It no longer felt like a choice, felt like a fact. Belief was assumed, and when someone knows they are believed, they stop explaining. Not out of deception, but out of comfort. Details become shorter. Clarifications feel unnecessary. The story, already accepted, no longer needs reinforcement. That is the quiet power of belief. It simplifies interactions. It smooths uncertainty, but it also removes friction. And friction, when healthy, keeps balance intact. The absence of friction changed the emotional dynamic. One side carried the responsibility of maintaining harmony. The other carried the freedom of being trusted. Neither was intentional, neither was spoken, but both were felt. Being believed can feel like permission. Permission to assume. Permission to decide. Permission to move forward without checking. Again, nothing extreme. Just small moments of confidence. Confidence in presence. Confidence in choices. Confidence in outcomes. And confidence, when unchallenged, naturally expands. This expansion wasn't aggressive. It was gradual. It looked like initiative, like helpfulness, like stepping in before being asked. On the surface, these actions appeared generous. But generosity without balance can quietly shift control. Meanwhile, the one offering trust began to feel a subtle pressure, not from demands, but from expectation. Expectation to remain consistent. Expectation to continue accommodating. Expectation to uphold the original kindness. Because once trust is given, withdrawing it feels like betrayal, even when nothing has been promised. This is the emotional bind of belief. Believing someone creates responsibility, not just for them, but for the believer. Ties identity to choice. I am the kind of person who trusts. Letting go of that identity feels like losing something important. So discomfort was rationalized. Questions were postponed. The weight of belief settled deeper. It showed up as self-doubt, as hesitation to speak honestly, as concern about seeming unfair. None of these feelings were dramatic. They were quiet, easy to carry, until they weren't. Belief had created imbalance, not because belief is wrong, but because it had replaced clarity. Clarity asks for conversation. Belief assumes understanding. Assumption, once rooted, does not easily loosen. And when belief goes unquestioned, it becomes a structure that supports, but also confines. At this stage, nothing had broken, but something had shifted beyond repair. The trust that once felt mutual now felt directional, flowing more one way than the other. That realization arrived softly, almost apologetically, a thought that felt uncomfortable to acknowledge. Why does this feel heavier than before? That question lingered. In the next part, we will examine how emotional weight leads to subtle imbalance, and why recognizing that imbalance is often the beginning of quiet change. Safe spaces are built on trust. They are places where people relax, where defenses lower, where careful thinking gives way to comfort. That was the intention here. Nothing felt rushed. Nothing felt forced. The environment encouraged ease. And ease invites honesty. But it can also invite omission. Not deliberate omission, natural omission. When a space feels safe, we assume everything important will surface on its own. We don't press. We don't probe. We let things arrive when they are ready. But some things don't arrive unless they are invited. In this space, many things went unsaid, not because they were hidden, but because they felt unnecessary to explain. Trust had replaced curiosity. Curiosity is gentle, but it still asks. Trust, when settled, often stops asking. The result was quiet gaps, small areas where clarity should have lived. Those gaps weren't obvious. They blended in. They were filled with assumption. An assumption felt comfortable. Comfort told a convincing story. There is nothing else you need to know. And for a while, That felt true. But safe spaces carry responsibility. They require maintenance, balance, awareness. When a space is assumed safe, rather than actively kept safe, things can shift unnoticed. In this case, safety became familiarity. Familiarity became routine. Routine replaced reflection. Moments passed without review. Actions were interpreted through goodwill alone. And goodwill, when unexamined, can blur accountability. There were signs, not warnings, just subtle changes. Decisions made more confidently. Opinions shared more freely. Nothing inappropriate, just influence. Influence that had not been discussed. Influence that had not been agreed upon. It existed because space allowed it. And safe spaces often do. This is not a failure of kindness. It is a feature of human connection. We relax where we feel accepted. We take up space where we feel secure. But safety without boundaries can slowly redefine roles. Who leads? Who adapts? Who stays quiet? Those roles began to settle, without conversation. And once roles settle, they resist change. Speaking up would have required disruption. Disruption would have challenged the sense of safety. So silence remained the easier choice. But silence in safe spaces carries a unique cost. It erodes self-trust. When feelings are consistently set aside, we stop recognizing them as signals. We label them overthinking, sensitivity, imagination, and in doing so, we disconnect from our own awareness. That disconnection was subtle, almost invisible, until it wasn't. A moment arrived, small and quiet, when something felt clearly misaligned. Not alarming, not urgent, just undeniably present. A realization that safety should not feel heavy, that trust should not feel one-sided, that silence should not feel necessary. That realization didn't demand action yet. It simply existed, waiting. In the next part, we will explore how patterns begin to reveal themselves, and why noticing those patterns often brings more confusion than clarity at first. Patterns rarely announce themselves. They don't arrive with certainty. They emerge slowly, through repetition. At first, repetition feels normal, comforting even, but when repetition begins to replace choice, something shifts. By now, certain behaviors felt expected, not requested, expected. Plans formed without discussion. Decisions moved forward without pause. Again, nothing dramatic, just consistency. And consistency can be persuasive. When the same outcome happens again and again, we stop questioning how it happened. We accept it as the natural order. That acceptance is where patterns hide. Small moments began to echo each other. Similar assumptions, similar responses. They didn't contradict each other. They aligned too well, almost predictably. That predictability felt strange. Not wrong, just noticeable. Patterns that align too perfectly often mask complexity. Life is usually uneven, messy, uncertain. Here, uncertainty had been smoothed out. Emotions followed expected paths. Reactions arrived on time. Everything fit neatly, and neatness can be misleading. There were moments when flexibility disappeared. Not forcefully, gently. Alternatives were acknowledged, then quietly dismissed. Not argued against, just moved past. That subtle dismissal created distance. Distance between thought and expression, between feeling and voice. Patterns once noticed, changed perception. The same actions now felt heavier. The same words carried more weight. Nothing had changed externally, but internally awareness had sharpened. Awareness brings discomfort, because awareness demands response, and response threatens balance. It became clear that some patterns favored one side. Time, tension, adjustment, not intentionally, but consistently. Consistency reveals preference, and preference, when unspoken, creates imbalance. This imbalance wasn't dramatic. It was cumulative, like small weights added gradually. unnoticed until they are too heavy to ignore. Trust was still present. Kindness remained. But the pattern suggested something else. Comfort had turned into expectation. Expectation had turned into routine. And routine was no longer mutual. This realization did not bring clarity. It brought confusion, because acknowledging patterns meant questioning intention, and questioning intention felt unfair. So the mind searched for explanations. Maybe this is temporary. Maybe this is how trust looks. Maybe I'm misreading it. These thoughts softened concern. They postponed decision. But patterns do not disappear. When explained away, they continue, quietly. And the longer they continue, the harder they are to change. Because patterns create structure. And structure resists interruption. This is the moment when many people pause. Not because they are afraid, but because they are uncertain. Uncertain about what they feel. Uncertain about what is fair. Uncertain about what to do next. That uncertainty became present here. Not overwhelming, just persistent. A low hum beneath everyday interactions. Something was forming. In the next part, we will explore how gratitude can begin to feel rehearsed, and why that feeling often marks the shift from sincerity to strategy. Gratitude is usually easy to recognize. It feels spontaneous, unpolished, uneven. It arrives in moments, not patterns. At first, gratitude had felt genuine, warm, unforced. It matched the situation. But over time, something subtle changed. The expressions of thanks became consistent, predictable, always appropriate, always timed just right. There was nothing wrong with that. Yet it felt different, not insincere, just familiar. Gratitude began to sound the same each time. The tone rarely shifted. The message stayed intact. Consistency again. Consistency that didn't evolve. Real gratitude changes with circumstances. It deepens. It softens. Sometimes it fades into action. Here it remained verbal, carefully maintained. That maintenance stood out. Because gratitude, when repeated without variation, can become a tool, not a manipulative one, a stabilizing one. It reassures. It reinforces. Preserves the status quo. Each expression of gratitude reminded the listener of their original kindness, kept the narrative intact. You helped. I appreciate it. This matters to me. Those words carry weight. They appeal to identity, to goodness, to consistency. And when someone identifies with being helpful, gratitude strengthens that role. It becomes harder to step back. This is not wrongdoing. It is human behavior. Gratitude creates connection, but it can also create obligation, especially when gratitude is emphasized. More than action. The imbalance became clearer here. Thanks were given, but boundaries were not adjusted. Appreciation was voiced, but expectations remained unchanged. The gratitude felt complete, but something else felt missing. Reciprocity. Not equal effort, just awareness, a recognition of shared impact. Instead, gratitude seemed to close conversations. Before they began, it ended thoughts with comfort. Everything is appreciated, so everything is fine. That message, unspoken but felt, discouraged further discussion. Why complicate something that appears settled? The practiced nature of gratitude created emotional reassurance. It made questioning feel unnecessary, even ungrateful, and no one wants to appear ungrateful for being trusted or for helping. But gratitude should invite connection, not silence. When gratitude starts to feel like punctuation, ending reflection rather than opening it, something important has shifted. This realization did not arrive suddenly. It unfolded over time. In moments where appreciation felt expected, rather than felt. Moments where gratitude arrived quickly, almost automatically. Those moments created pause. A quiet internal response. Why does this feel familiar? Familiarity can be comforting, but it can also be numbing. It can keep situations exactly as they are, even when change is needed. Trust remained present. Kindness remained. But gratitude had begun to function differently. It no longer reflected connection, protected structure. And structures, once protected, are hard to question. In the next part, we will explore how the cost of assuming good intentions becomes visible, and why that cost often appears as emotional exhaustion rather than conflict. Assuming good intentions feels generous. It reflects optimism, empathy, a belief in people. For a long time, that assumption guided everything here. Every action was filtered through goodwill. Every inconsistency softened by understanding. That approach kept the situation calm. But calm can be deceptive, because assuming good intentions has a cost. Not immediate, gradual. The cost appeared as adjustment. Small adjustments at first. A schedule shifted. Preference delayed. A feeling set aside. Each adjustment felt reasonable. None of them seemed worth mentioning. But adjustment, when repeated, becomes effort. And effort, when unacknowledged, becomes fatigue. That fatigue arrived quietly, not as frustration, as heaviness, a sense that maintaining balance required attention. More attention than before. Good intentions were still assumed. Kindness was still believed. But the emotional energy required to sustain that belief increased. This is where trust begins to strain. Not because it has been broken, but because it has been carrying too much. When good intentions are assumed without verification, they absorb responsibility. They excuse behavior. They delay clarity. They protect connection at the expense of understanding. The cost was not visible from the outside. Everything still looked composed. But internally, the effort was noticeable. Decisions required more thought. Responses were measured carefully. Not out of fear, out of caution. Caution is often misunderstood. It is not suspicion. It is awareness waking up. The mind began to track patterns more closely, to notice cause and effect. Still, nothing pointed to harm, just imbalance. And imbalance is harder to confront, because it doesn't feel urgent. It feels ambiguous. Ambiguity is uncomfortable. People often resolve it by choosing the explanation. That causes the least disruption. In this case, good intentions remained the explanation. They mean well. They don't realize. It's not intentional. These thoughts reduce tension. But they also postponed action. And postponement has a price. The price is clarity delayed. The longer clarity is delayed, the heavier it becomes. This is how emotional exhaustion begins. Not through conflict, but through constant internal negotiation. What should I say? Is this worth mentioning? Am I overreacting? Those questions repeated. Repetition wears down resolve. The cost of assuming good intentions was not trust lost, but energy spent. Energy that once flowed naturally, now required management. Trust was still present, but it felt maintained rather than shared. That difference matters, because trust should restore energy, not consume it. This realization did not demand immediate change. It simply clarified something important, that kindness alone is not enough, that trust needs structure, that good intentions, without awareness, can still create imbalance. In the next part, we will examine how invisible lines begin to shift, and why those shifts are often recognized only after they have already moved. Boundaries are rarely announced. They exist quietly, understood rather than spoken. At the beginning, those boundaries felt clear. They were implied by context, by courtesy, by mutual respect. No one needed to define them. But over time, those invisible lines began to move. Not suddenly, not forcefully. They shifted through small actions. A decision made without checking. A space entered without asking. Preference assumed rather than confirmed. Each moment felt minor, too small to interrupt. But boundaries don't erode through one large act. They erode through many small ones. and small changes are easier to accept because responding to them feels unnecessary. At first, these shifts went unnoticed. Then they were noticed, but dismissed. Probably nothing, just convenience. Not worth addressing. That reasoning felt kind. It preserved harmony. But harmony built on adjustment requires constant upkeep. The lines continued to move. What once required discussion now happened automatically. What once felt optional now felt expected. These changes were not requested. They were assumed. Assumption had quietly replaced agreement. This is how invisible lines fade. Not through conflict, but through familiarity. When something happens often enough, it stops feeling like a choice. It becomes the default. And defaults are powerful. They shape behavior without discussion. At this stage, speaking up would have required explanation. Explaining would have required acknowledging change. Acknowledging change would have required admitting discomfort. So silence remained easier. But silence has consequences. The person adjusting began to feel less present in decisions, less consulted, less certain of their own role, not excluded, just secondary. That feeling is difficult to articulate. It lacks sharp edges. It doesn't point to wrongdoing. It simply signals imbalance. Trust was still present, but it was no longer grounding. It felt directional, flowing outward more than inward. The realization came slowly, a moment of hesitation before agreeing, pause before responding. These pauses were new. They marked awareness, awareness that something had shifted, without being discussed. An unspoken change can be destabilizing, because it removes shared understanding. When lines move invisibly, no one knows where they stand. That uncertainty affects behavior. It makes people cautious, careful, not open. Trust at this point began to feel conditional, not because conditions were stated, but because comfort depended on compliance. Again, nothing explicit, just a feeling, a subtle sense that saying no would disrupt more than it should. That sense matters, because trust should allow refusal. It should allow adjustment. It should allow change. Here, change felt difficult, not impossible, just heavy. And heaviness signals something important. It suggests that balance has been compromised. In the next part, we will explore how subtle control can emerge without intention, and why recognizing it often feels like questioning one's own judgment. Control does not always announce itself. It rarely looks commanding. It often looks helpful. At this point, the situation still felt calm, orderly, functional. But the flow of decisions had changed. Choices were being made quickly, smoothly, without discussion. Not because discussion was denied, but because it no longer seemed necessary. That is how subtle control forms. It grows in spaces where trust is assumed, and boundaries are blurred. Control, in this sense, was not about authority. It was about direction. Who initiated? Who finalized? Who adapted? These roles had shifted quietly. Initiative was praised. Decisiveness was appreciated. Those qualities are usually positive. But when one person consistently leads, and the other consistently adjusts, balance changes. The adjusting side feels flexible at first, accommodating, understanding. Over time, that flexibility becomes expectation. Expectation creates pressure. Not spoken pressure, internal pressure, a sense that resisting would require explanation, that hesitation would need justification, and justification feels uncomfortable when nothing appears wrong. This is where control becomes difficult to recognize, because it doesn't restrict, it directs, it doesn't demand, it assumes. The person being trusted may not notice the shift. From their perspective, everything feels natural. From the other side, things feel increasingly managed. Not managed in action, but in direction. Control at this level is emotional. It shapes decisions before they are voiced. It influences what feels acceptable to suggest. Certain alternatives are no longer considered, not because they are forbidden, but because they feel impractical. Impracticality is a powerful filter. It narrows options quietly, and when options narrow, freedom feels limited, even without restriction. This realization was uncomfortable, not because it revealed wrongdoing, but because it challenged self-perception. Admitting a loss of control felt like admitting weakness. That admission didn't align with reality. Nothing had been taken, but something had shifted. Responsibility had moved, not intentionally, not maliciously, but consistently. Consistency creates structure, and structure, once formed, guides behavior. Breaking that structure requires effort. Effort risks tension, so the structure remained. Control at this stage was not a problem. It was a signal that trust had evolved into something else, something less mutual. Still, no action was taken. Not yet, because recognizing subtle control does not immediately provide solutions. It raises questions instead. Is this intentional? Am I imagining this? Is this just how closeness works? Those questions created doubt. Doubt slowed response, and slowed response allowed the pattern to continue. This is how situations settle into imbalance. Not through conflict, but through hesitation. In the next part, we will look at the moment trust begins to feel different, and why that feeling often arrives before understanding does. There is a moment when trust changes its tone. Nothing dramatic happens. No single event marks it. It is felt, not observed. That moment arrived quietly. The same interactions continued. The same routines stayed in place. But the feeling underneath them shifted. Trust no longer felt light, felt managed, not controlled, just guided. That difference is subtle, but important. Trust, when healthy, feels open. It allows movement in many directions. Here, movement felt narrower. Choices still existed, but they came with an invisible pause, a moment of internal calculation. Is this worth bringing up? Will this complicate things? Should I just let it go? Those thoughts were new. They signaled change. Trust had begun to require effort. Not effort to maintain safety, but effort to preserve comfort. Comfort had become something to protect, and protecting comfort often means avoiding truth. This realization didn't arrive as certainty. It arrived as confusion. Confusion about why ease felt conditional, about why speaking honestly felt risky. Nothing suggested negative consequences. Still, the hesitation remained. That hesitation mattered, because trust should reduce hesitation, not create it. The feeling was difficult to explain. If asked, everything still sounded fine. No rules had changed. No demands were made. Yet something was different. Trust now carried expectation. Expectation to respond predictably. Expectation to agree easily. Expectation to maintain the established rhythm. Rhythm can be comforting, but it can also limit. When rhythm becomes rigid, it resists variation. Variation is where honesty lives. This is where trust began to feel less like connection, and more like responsibility. Responsibility to stay consistent, to remain accommodating, to avoid disruption. Again, none of this was spoken, but it was felt. Feelings often recognize truth before the mind is ready to accept it. The internal response shifted from ease to alertness, not fear. Awareness. Awareness that trust had crossed a threshold. It was no longer just belief. It was structure. And structure can support or constrain. At this point, no conclusion had been reached. No decision made. Just recognition. Recognition that trust had changed shape. That recognition brought quiet grief. Not for what was lost, but for what had been expected. Trust had promised simplicity. Instead, it had grown complex. Complexity requires attention. Attention invites choice. Choice threatens comfort. This is why many people remain here. in the space between knowing and acting. It is an uncomfortable place, but it is also honest. The realization settled without urgency. It didn't demand immediate response. It simply asked to be acknowledged. And acknowledgement is the first step toward clarity. In the next part, we will explore the tension between instinct and explanation, and why listening to instinct can feel more unsettling than ignoring it. Instinct speaks softly. It doesn't argue. It doesn't explain. It simply appears as a feeling that something needs attention. At this stage, instinct had become noticeable, not urgent, persistent. It showed up as pause, as reconsideration, as a quiet sense that something required clarity. But instinct often conflicts with explanation. Explanation is comfortable. It organizes uncertainty. Instinct disrupts that comfort. Here, explanations were easy to find. Everything had a reasonable context. Every behavior could be justified. Trust had been built over time. Kindness had been consistent. There was no obvious reason to doubt. So explanation competed with instinct. Explanation said, "This is normal. This is just adjustment. This is how trust grows." Instinct said nothing specific. It simply remained. That silence made instinct harder to follow. We are taught to value logic, to trust what can be explained. Instinct, by contrast, offers no evidence. It asks to be felt, not proven. Listening to instinct felt risky. It suggested discomfort where none was visible. It implied imbalance without accusation. And responding to that implication felt like overreaction. So instinct was questioned, rationalized, set aside. But instinct doesn't disappear. When ignored, it waits. It grows stronger through repetition. Each moment of hesitation reinforced it. Each internal pause added weight. Eventually, the effort required to ignore instinct became noticeable. Ignoring it took more energy than acknowledging it. That realization marked another shift. Not in action, but in awareness. The question changed. Not, "Is something wrong?" but, "Why does this keep coming back?" That question mattered, because persistent instinct usually signals something unresolved. Not necessarily something harmful, something unspoken. Explanation alone could no longer resolve it. Explanation had reached its limit. Instinct demanded attention. This created internal tension, a desire to preserve harmony, against a need for clarity. Harmony felt fragile. Clarity felt disruptive. Choosing clarity meant risking change. Change meant admitting that trust needed adjustment. That admission felt heavy, but avoiding it felt heavier. This is the crossroads many people face. Not between safety and danger, but between comfort and honesty. Instinct does not demand action. It asks for awareness. Awareness opens space for choice. And choice introduces responsibility. Responsibility to oneself. At this moment, nothing had been said. No boundaries redefined. No expectations clarified. But something had shifted internally. Instinct was no longer background noise. It was present, waiting. In the next part, we will explore how kindness can begin to carry consequences, and why those consequences are often emotional rather than visible. Kindness is rarely questioned. It is seen as inherently good, protective, safe. In the beginning, kindness shaped every decision here. It guided choices, softened uncertainty, created connection. But kindness, when extended without reflection, can carry consequences, not obvious ones, quiet ones. At this stage, kindness had become habitual. The initial act of care had evolved into ongoing accommodation. Accommodation felt natural, expected, and expectations change how kindness functions. What begins as generosity can slowly become obligation, not imposed, internalized. The person offering kindness began to feel responsible for maintaining emotional balance, for avoiding discomfort, for ensuring continuity. This responsibility was never requested. It emerged from care. Care, when unchecked, can overextend. And overextension has a cost. That cost appeared as restraint, holding back honest reactions, choosing words carefully, avoiding certain topics, all in service of kindness. But kindness that silences honesty is no longer neutral, protects one side at the expense of the other. This realization was uncomfortable because kindness is tied to identity. Questioning its impact felt like questioning oneself. But the consequences were becoming clear. Energy was being spent to preserve calm. Attention was being redirected away from personal needs. Kindness had shifted from choice to role, a role that felt difficult to step out of, because stepping out might disappoint, might confuse, might require explanation. Explanation invites evaluation, and evaluation risks change. Still, kindness remained real. This was not exploitation. It was misalignment. Kindness had outpaced clarity. And when kindness leads without clarity, boundaries blur. The emotional consequence was subtle strain. Not resentment, not anger, just fatigue. A sense that giving required effort. That effort had not existed before. That change mattered. Because kindness should feel replenishing. When it begins to drain, it signals imbalance. Recognizing this did not erase kindness. It recontextualized it. Kindness was no longer sufficient on its own. It needed structure. It needed limits. Not to withdraw care, but to preserve it. This realization did not lead to action yet. It led to contemplation, to a quiet understanding that something must change. Change did not mean rejection. It meant recalibration. But recalibration requires conversation. And conversation requires courage. Courage to risk discomfort in service of honesty. That courage was still forming. In the next part, we will examine how loyalty can blind perception and why breaking loyalty to preserve truth often feels like betrayal. Loyalty feels noble. It is associated with strength, consistency, integrity. Once trust had been established, loyalty followed naturally, not declared, assumed. Loyalty showed up as patience, as benefit of the doubt, as staying silent when speaking felt easier. It reinforced the original decision to trust. I committed to this. I should see it through. Those thoughts carried weight. Loyalty can steady relationships, but it can also narrow perspective. When loyalty becomes a guiding principle, it filters perception. It emphasizes continuity over clarity, stability over truth. That was happening here. Signs that once felt noticeable were now reframed, not ignored, reinterpreted. Everything was viewed through loyalty. If I'm loyal, I won't question. If I'm loyal, I'll adjust. If I'm loyal, I'll understand. Loyalty became synonymous with silence. Silence felt respectful, supportive, but silence also removed feedback. And without feedback, patterns continue unchecked. This loyalty was not demanded. It was self-imposed. That made it harder to challenge. Breaking loyalty felt like breaking character, like becoming someone unreliable, unkind. But loyalty without reflection can trap people in roles that no longer serve them. This realization was slow. It didn't arrive as a conclusion. It arrived as fatigue. Fatigue from maintaining alignment that no longer felt mutual. Loyalty had begun to require justification. Why am I staying quiet? Who is this helping? Those questions felt disloyal to ask. And yet they persisted. Loyalty, when questioned, reveals its limits. It should not require self-erasure. It should not override awareness. Here, loyalty had started to obscure imbalance. Not intentionally, but effectively. The belief that loyalty was necessary had delayed honest assessment, kept the situation stable, but not healthy. Stability without health eventually collapses, not dramatically, internally. The realization that loyalty was interfering with clarity was sobering. It suggested that preserving truth might require risking disappointment. That risk felt heavy, because loyalty promises safety, but safety built on silence is fragile. At this point, the internal shift was undeniable. Loyalty had reached its limit, not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete. It needed to be paired with honesty. Honesty introduces uncertainty. Uncertainty threatens comfort, but comfort was already compromised. This recognition did not resolve anything yet. It simply reframed the situation. Loyalty was no longer the highest value. Balance was, and balance requires courage. In the next part, we will explore the quiet realization that changes everything, and why understanding often arrives without words. Realizations are often imagined as sudden, clear, decisive, but most important realizations arrive quietly. They don't interrupt. They settle. This one came without urgency. No moment demanded action. No event forced clarity. It arrived as acceptance. Acceptance that something had changed. Not externally. Internally. The effort to maintain comfort was now visible. The emotional cost was undeniable. That awareness did not bring blame. It brought understanding. Understanding that trust, kindness, loyalty, all had been extended generously. But generosity alone could not sustain balance. The realization was simple. The situation no longer felt mutual. That thought carried weight. Not because it accused, but because it clarified. Mutuality had been assumed. Now it was questioned. And questioning mutuality changes everything. It reframes past decisions. It alters present feelings. It opens the door to choice. This realization did not create anger. It created calm. A calm that comes from naming something honestly, without labels, without drama, just recognition. Recognition that silence had protected comfort, but delayed truth. That kindness had nurtured connection, but blurred boundaries. That loyalty had preserved stability, but obscured imbalance. This understanding arrived together, not as fragments, as a whole, felt like stepping back and seeing the full shape of the situation. From that perspective, the path forward became clearer, not easier, clearer. Clarity does not remove difficulty. It defines it. The realization did not demand confrontation. It did not require accusation. It simply required alignment. Alignment between feeling and action, between awareness and response. At this stage, the internal conflict resolved, not because everything was fixed, but because confusion had lifted. Confusion had been the heaviest burden. Now there was direction. Direction does not always mean movement. Sometimes it means preparation. Preparation for honesty. Preparation for change. Change, in this case, did not mean withdrawal. It meant recalibration. Trust would need structure. Kindness would need limits. Loyalty would need honesty. These needs felt reasonable. They did not feel threatening. That realization was empowering. It returned agency. The feeling of being carried by the situation was replaced by the feeling of choosing within it. Choice restores balance, even before it is exercised. This moment marked the true turning point, not in action, but in understanding. Everything that followed would be guided by this realization. In the next part, we will explore how truth can exist without drama, and why clarity does not require conflict to be meaningful. Raised voices, strong reactions, clear winners and losers. But truth does not require noise. Sometimes truth is quiet. At this stage, the realization had settled. There was no urgency to act. No need to justify feelings. No need to assign fault. Truth existed as understanding. Understanding that balance mattered more than comfort. That clarity mattered more than silence. This kind of truth does not demand immediate expression. It asks for intention. Intention about how to move forward. There was a temptation to dramatize the moment, to turn awareness into declaration. But that would have changed the nature of the truth. Because the truth here was not about wrongdoing. It was about misalignment. Misalignment does not require accusation. It requires adjustment. This distinction mattered. Responding without drama preserved dignity. On both sides, it allowed space for reflection, rather than defensiveness. The truth was simple. Trust had evolved beyond its original shape. It needed recalibration. That recalibration could be gentle. Truth does not need to shock to be effective. It needs to be clear. Clear truth allows choice. Choice creates agency. Agency restores balance. At this moment, clarity replaced confusion. The mind no longer searched for explanations. It accepted what was present. This acceptance reduced emotional strain. The effort to maintain appearances dissolved. Truth, acknowledged internally, lightened the emotional load. Nothing had been said yet, but something had been resolved. This internal resolution was powerful. It meant that any future action would come from steadiness, not reaction. That steadiness mattered. Protected intention. It ensured that honesty, when expressed, would be thoughtful, not reactive. Truth without drama is often misunderstood. It is seen as avoidance. In reality, it is respect. Respect for complexity. Respect for people. Respect for self. This approach allowed patience. Patience to choose the right moment, the right words. Words that reflect understanding, not accusation. The goal was not to disrupt. It was to restore balance. Restoration does not require collapse. It requires alignment. This realization reframed the future. Change would not be forced. It would be intentional. That intention brought calm. A calm that comes from knowing what matters. In the next part, we will explore how responsibility emerges after belief, and why recognizing responsibility often changes how we act. Belief changes responsibility. When we choose to believe someone, we don't just offer trust. We take on a role. That role is rarely discussed. It forms quietly. Belief suggests endorsement, support, stability, and once belief is established, responsibility follows. Responsibility to be consistent, to be fair, to uphold what belief implies. At this stage, belief was no longer passive. It had shaped expectations. It had influenced behavior. Recognizing that brought a new layer of awareness. Belief had created impact, not intentionally, not negatively, but meaningfully. With belief comes influence, and with influence comes responsibility. This responsibility was not about correcting someone else. It was about responding honestly to reality. Belief had allowed patterns to settle. Silence had allowed imbalance to continue. Now, awareness shifted responsibility inward. What happens next matters. Not because something is wrong, but because something is clear. Clarity brings obligation. Obligation to align actions with understanding. That alignment does not require confrontation. It requires integrity. Integrity asks simple questions. Am I acting in a way that reflects what I know? Does my silence support balance or avoid discomfort? What responsibility do I have now that I see clearly? These questions were not heavy. They were grounding. They shifted focus from interpretation to intention. Responsibility after belief means choosing how trust evolves. Trust does not have to end. To be adjusted, can be reshaped. Reshaping trust requires participation. It requires voice. Voice does not have to be loud. It has to be honest. The awareness here created readiness. Readiness to speak thoughtfully. Readiness to set gentle limits. Readiness to restore mutuality. This readiness felt different from urgency. Felt calm. Because responsibility was no longer confused with guilt. Nothing had been done wrong, but something needed to be done differently. That difference mattered. Responsibility also meant releasing assumptions. assumptions about intent, assumptions about obligation. Belief had been generous. Now it needed balance. Balance does not remove care, protects it. This understanding reframed the situation. Responsibility was not about fixing someone. It was about honoring self-awareness, about recognizing that trust, once changed, requires conscious upkeep, not automatic continuation. This moment marked another shift, from observation to preparation, preparation for honest adjustment, not dramatic change, measured change, change rooted in respect, respect for self, respect for the connection. Belief had brought them here. Responsibility would guide what followed. In the next part, we will explore how choosing clarity over comfort reshapes outcomes, and why that choice often feels quieter than expected. Comfort is persuasive. It asks very little. It rewards silence, promises stability. For a long time, comfort guided decisions here. It softened questions, delayed clarity, protected routine. But comfort has limits. When clarity arrives, comfort must be reconsidered. At this stage, the choice was clear. Not dramatic, not urgent, simply present. Continue preserving comfort, or begin honoring clarity. Clarity did not demand confrontation. It did not require explanation of every feeling. It asked for alignment, alignment between awareness and behavior. Choosing clarity meant accepting brief discomfort, not conflict, just adjustment. Adjustment can feel unsettling. It changes rhythm, introduces uncertainty. But uncertainty, when intentional, is healthier than comfort built on silence. This choice reframed priorities. The goal was no longer to maintain ease. It was to restore balance. Balance requires visibility, visibility of needs, of limits, of expectations. Comfort avoids these conversations. Clarity invites them. The invitation does not have to be forceful, can be gentle. Clarity can be expressed through small changes, pausing before agreeing, asking questions, reintroducing discussion. These actions are subtle, but they matter. They signal self-respect. Choosing clarity also meant releasing fear. Fear of disappointing, fear of disrupting harmony. Harmony that depends on silence is fragile. Clarity strengthens connection by making it honest. This understanding brought relief. Relief that honesty did not require rejection, that clarity did not equal withdrawal. It meant redefining engagement. Redefinition is not loss. It is evolution. Trust evolves. Healthy trust adapts. This moment marked that adaptation. Comfort had served its purpose. It allowed connection to form. Now clarity would allow it to continue, or change, with integrity. That integrity mattered more than ease. Because ease without honesty leads to resentment. Clarity prevents that. This decision did not create distance. It created grounding. Grounding in self-awareness. That grounding restored agency. Agency removes helplessness. Helplessness had never been explicit, but it had been felt. Now it dissolved. Choosing clarity over comfort did not resolve everything instantly, but it established direction. Direction matters because it shapes future responses. In the next part, we will explore how one decision continues to shape long-term impact and why its effects are often quieter than expected. Decisions do not always end stories. Sometimes they begin a longer one. Choosing clarity over comfort did not change everything at once. There was no visible shift, no immediate response. Life continued, but the internal alignment changed how each moment was experienced. Small choices felt different now. Responses were more intentional. Silence was no longer automatic. This is the quiet impact of one decision. It doesn't announce itself. It reshapes perspective. Clarity influenced what felt acceptable, what felt necessary, what felt optional. The long shadow of that choice appeared in awareness. Awareness of when to pause, when to speak, when to listen more carefully. Trust was no longer assumed. It was engaged with. That engagement brought balance. Not perfect balance. Honest balance. Over time, this affected the emotional environment. Interactions felt steadier, less draining, not because everything was resolved, but because expectations were no longer carried silently. That shift mattered. Prevented resentment from forming. Protected kindness from exhaustion. One decision had altered the direction of the story. Not dramatically, sustainably. This is how meaningful change often works. It does not arrive as transformation. It arrives as consistency. Consistency in honoring awareness. In responding with intention. The effects extended beyond the immediate situation. Clarity sharpened perception elsewhere. It influenced how trust was offered in other areas. How boundaries were recognized. How silence was interpreted. The decision became a reference point. A quiet reminder. That feeling matters. Pausing is allowed. Comfort is not the same as balance. These reminders shaped behavior subtly. They did not restrict generosity. They refined it. Trust remained possible, but it became conscious. Kindness remained present, but it became sustainable. Loyalty remained valued, but it included honesty. The long shadow of this decision was not heavy. It was grounding. It reduced internal conflict, because actions now aligned with understanding. That alignment created calm. Calm that does not depend on others changing, only on self-respect. This is where many stories end quietly, not with closure, but with continuation. The situation did not disappear. It evolved. And evolution, when guided by clarity, is healthy. In the final part, we will reflect on what trust ultimately asks of us, and how quiet realizations often leave the deepest impact. Trust is often described as something we give, a gesture, an offering, a belief placed in someone else. But over time, trust reveals another truth. It asks something in return. Not loyalty, not silence, not endurance. It asks for awareness. Real trust does not require us to disappear. It does not ask us to ignore discomfort. It asks us to stay present, to stay honest, to stay aligned with ourselves. This story did not end with a dramatic change. No sharp break, no final declaration. It ended with understanding. An understanding that trust evolves. And when it does, we must evolve with it. The quiet realization at the heart of this journey was not about another person. It was about responsibility. Responsibility to notice when trust begins to feel heavy. Responsibility to question silence when it replaces honesty. Responsibility to choose clarity even when comfort is available. These responsibilities are subtle. They do not demand action from others. They ask something of us. They ask us to listen, to the pauses, to the hesitation, to the internal signals we often dismiss. Trust asks us to believe, but not blindly. It asks us to care, but not at the cost of self-respect. It asks us to be kind, but not quiet when clarity is needed. The unexpected truth in this story is that nothing had to break for something to be learned. No rules were violated. No harm was intended. And yet, something important was revealed. That trust without reflection can drift. That kindness without boundaries can strain. That loyalty without honesty can obscure truth. The moral twist is simple. Trust is not proven by how much we endure. It is proven by how clearly we respond. When something changes, in the end, trust asked for courage. Not loud courage, quiet courage. The courage to adjust, to realign, to choose balance over habit. That courage did not demand resolution. Created peace. Peace that comes from alignment, from knowing that trust, when honored properly, strengthens everyone involved. This is not a story of loss. It is a story of understanding. Understanding that trust is not static. It is a living exchange. And when we listen closely, It tells us exactly what it needs, sometimes softly, sometimes late, but always honestly. And that is where the story rests, not with answers, but with awareness, a silent realization that trust, in the end, asks us to remain awake,